One of the biggest topics in poker is bluffing. Today, I'll show you how to set up a bluff. I differentiate the topic into two different areas, the technical side of the bluff and the psychological side. Let's start with the technical side. The first question on the technical side might be a bit counterintuitive, but it actually starts with value hands. It's always kind of a package with value hands and bluffs and them balancing each other out. A really important thought is always, what kind of value hands do I have here and how many? So how often do I have a value hand here, or more advanced, how many combinations of value hands do I have there? In addition to the bet size you then choose, that kind of drives your bluffs in a very technical way. First, we want to think about the value hands we have there. Then we also want to think about the bet size, and then kind of bluffs are a construct in that bigger package. So if you're not an extremely advanced poker player, then maybe just ask you these simple questions. First of all, are we representing a lot of strong hands or strong hands in general with the type of bet you're choosing? Can we have a lot of value hands on this type of run out with the action that took place? That's a really important question to ask, because if there's no strong hands you're representing in that particular line or in this board, that's already problematic. So bluffs generally will work better when you represent more or better value hands. The more strong hands we can represent or credibly represent, the more or generally the better our bluffs are going to work. Really try to think about what value hands do you represent? Also, maybe how many more you have than your opponent. Is it evenly distributed? Do you have value hands and he has different ones? Or is it more like you have a lot of strong value hands and he has none of them? This is extremely important to set up your bluff. So as the second little part of this section, I actually think that the most important thing is to think about your opponent's range and the line that you've took or they took. A question I ask myself, and I would suggest you to ask yourself, how many strong hands and what type of strong hands does he have in this particular line? Definitely a moneymaker is this idea, which hands have been removed on an earlier street from your opponent. So for example, their pre-flop range construction. Let's say we're 20 big blinds deep, they just don't have certain hands because they go all in. So if they call, they don't have these hands anymore. So they're removed from their range. Or folding an earlier street. For example, when you bet twice, they fold certain straight draws and then they don't have these straights on the river. Thinking about that as well, which hands that are strong hands on a certain street, they folded on an earlier street so they don't have anymore. Or kind of the other idea, raising an earlier street. So what hands they maybe raise on an earlier street, like they would raise a set on the flop on a wet board, or they would raise two pair on the flop. So when they raise all the strong hands on the flop, they don't have strong hands on turn and rivers. Or, and this also happens on high stakes, they maybe use a different sizing with different hand categories. They maybe go a small bet on the flop and then a medium bet on the turn. And then with this medium bet, they maybe don't have some of the value hands that they normally represent because they go for a big bet or a very big bet. All these things combined can really help you to narrow down and remove certain hands from their range. It's very important to have a really good idea of how the range of your opponent looks like and the hand strengths they represent or they most likely have in the line that you took them in. As a takeaway in this particular one, what I see a lot of really aggressive and very profitable players do is they look for turn call river fold spots, where the best spots are where opponents call the turn with medium strong hands, maybe draws as well as just middle pairs, and then there's a lot of hands on river they have that they're folding to a bet. I would say these generally are really great spots to set up your bluff when you know they have a lot of hands they call on the turn, and you always will find folds on the river and most likely will find them over folding, so your bluff becomes profitable. The third part in the technical side of things is actually a more advanced concept, but I want to bring it up anyway because a lot of people are talking about it now and it becomes actually a really misused concept. Blockers and unblocking and blocking value hands and unblocking bluffs or folds can be really important in certain spots, but you have to understand when and how. The value of blockers or unblocking certain things is kind of multiplied by the amount of hands that we're talking about. So let's assume we are in 1,000 big blind pot and we get to the river and we jam 2 times the pot and it's this super sick where we could have the uber nuts or we don't. When we are in this particular spot, we talk about very, very narrow value ranges and so very, very narrow bluffs. Here, blockers play a huge effect. With one card, we block full houses that he could call with, and those are the only hands that he calls with. That makes up 20% or 30% of his calling range. range, that can be massive. But in some spots, for example, the pot is small and there's a lot of value you can represent and the ranges are very wide, the blocker effect doesn't really make a big difference. If it's a wide range, the blocker effect is much less than if it is a very tight range where blockers can play a big role. So keep this in mind. Blockers are increasingly more important the tighter the ranges are. Let's jump into how they actually work. So basically the idea is we want to block their calls if we're bluffing. So if our opponent has hands that he calls and hands that he folds, it's great with a bluff if we have a card that removes hands from his calling range, because if we have this card, he can't have this card. And then on the other hand, the unblocking part can sometimes be we want to barrel pocket threes on ace, king, jack, 9, 7. Even though we have a pair and your tendency might be, oh, let me check this down, let me play this more passive. In some spots, when we have a strong range, this is actually a great candidate to bluff because we're unblocking certain folding hands. We have a little bit of equity, so unblocking can play a decent role as well. We can also block fold. So if we have cards in our hand that he's likely to fold with, those are not great bluffs because we don't want to block his folds. We want to block his value and unblock his folds. As a rule of thumb, I would say, think about blockers only when it's about big pots and narrow spots. It's not so important in these wider, more general spots. So to summarize the technical side, we want to identify spots where we represent a lot of value. We also want to find the spots where our opponent has a weaker range, or generally they have removed their strong hands on a previous street already. So they're kind of capped and have to work with a medium strong range. And particularly there, we want to look for those turn call river fold spots because those are really profitable when they have a lot of medium strong hands or draws that they then fold on the river. Last but not least, we want to block their value range in the dream scenario and unblock their folds. So all these things combined are important technical things to look at. All right, after we have talked about the technical side, let's get into the psychological side of things. There's obviously a big difference between online poker and live poker, but I'll touch base on some important factors. The most important one, and this is one I have to tell myself all the time, is don't try to make calling stations hero fold. One of the worst ideas in general. I try it all the time. I know it better and I do it anyway. Against calling stations, we want to maximize value by value betting thinner and choosing bigger sizings rather than just going out there and trying to bluff them and put them off hands that they're never gonna fold. So this is definitely the first and most important thing. Second, one thing I actually see very often is don't try to bluff the big stack that often. I genuinely see that people, when they have big stacks and it's about, let's say they have 3 starting stacks and you bluff off 1 starting stack, they're so much more open to call you off and call you off lighter. And I mean, there's some rational reason why that is fine because you're not risking your entire tournament life, but I also feel there's much more of a psychological one to it. You are much more free to put in 1 stack and much more than you are rationally supposed to. Another aspect here is be careful when you play against inexperienced opponents because they will overvalue their strong hands. I see this a lot that when they have queens, kings or aces, especially strong starting hands, or when they make some decently strong hands on the flop, when the board structure changes, that they're not willing to let them go just because they're not experienced enough to understand where their relative hand strength is and they overvalue the absolute hand strength. Be aware of that. Generally, humans, I think, tend to overvalue these things they start out with rather than to always reevaluate and look at it from a new perspective. Now, the next psychological part that is rather important, but also sometimes gets overvalued, and I've heard it a lot as justification for bad bluffs, is table image. How you have been playing in the past is obviously really important. That's how people who don't know you perceive you. So if you haven't played a lot of hands, so if your VP/IP is low, if your pre-flop raise is low, if your 3-bet is low, if you've played a rather passive style, I would say generally it's more likely that people will believe you and make folds against you, especially hero folds against you. I have done it myself. I take it into consideration, but I think it is also oftentimes overstated. So, oh, but I've folded 2 orbits, so now you run this crazy bluff and expect that someone is folding a strong hand. It doesn't work this way. I think it's important to take this somewhat in the middle. It's an important thing, an important factor we can look for is how are people perceiving us, but then it's also important to not overvalue it. Profile play is a huge role in general, but probably even more so when there's history. Look at my profile of how people perceive me as this, young, aggressive guy that's just always going after the pots and, 3 bets to lose and open raises to lose and so on. So it's important for me, especially when people have a strong perception of me, to work with that, to find strategies that long-term beat this perception and maybe even exploit them even more, knowing that they think that. Especially when you play poker a longer time, when you play against people on a regular basis, this is definitely something we can take advantage of and use to our advantage to make more money in poker. Now, if you want to run a successful bluff, put all these things together, look at the technical side of things of how to set up your bluff perfectly, find the spots where you represent a lot of value or your opponents have a weaker range, not so many strong hands they can call you down with, put them in tough spots, but also be aware of the psychological factors, both on how you're being perceived, but also how your opponents are thinking. Put all of them together, and the next time you're gonna run the perfect bluff. If you liked this video, then you will also like the video I created on where people do not bluff or where they under bluff and how to act accordingly. And if you guys like my content, as always, please leave a subscribe. It would highly encourage me to continue pumping out more content. So have a wonderful rest of your day and see you in Vegas.